Along the quiet banks of the Nile, where the water moved slowly beneath the desert sun, a civilization learned to see eternity in the rhythm of the river. The world they built was not only made of stone and sand, it was made of meaning. Every flood, every harvest, every sunrise carried within it a story older than any temple. And the people who lived along that great river, who watched its dark water rise and fall year after year, came to understand that the universe itself was alive, that it breathed and turned and returned, just as the Nile always returned. Welcome to First Beliefs, a place for slow exploration of the earliest ideas that shaped how human beings understood the world. Tonight, we are traveling back to one of the oldest and most enduring of all ancient traditions. We are going to sit quietly beside the river and listen to what the ancient Egyptians believed. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps this channel more than you may think. The river at the center of everything. To understand ancient Egyptian religion, it helps to first understand the land itself. Because in Egypt, geography and belief were never truly separate. The Nile River runs from south to north, cutting through one of the harshest deserts on earth. On either side of its banks, the land is fertile and green. Beyond that green margin, the desert begins almost immediately pale, dry, and immense. The ancient Egyptians had names for these two worlds. The fertile river land was called the Black Land, named for the rich dark soil deposited by the annual flood. The desert beyond was called the Red Land, vast, silent, and belonging to forces outside the human world. Life, then, was defined by proximity to the river. And the river was not merely a source of water, it was the organizing principle of existence itself. Every year, with a regularity that felt almost supernatural, the Nile flooded. The waters rose slowly from the south, fed by rainfall far upstream in regions the ancient Egyptians could not see. The flood brought with it dark silt, immensely fertile, and deposited it across the fields. When the waters receded, the land left behind was ready to grow. Farmers planted, crops rose. Then the dry season came again. The fields lay quiet, and the cycle began once more. This pattern, inundation, growth, harvest, and rest, repeated itself so consistently across so many generations that it became more than agriculture. It became theology. The ancient Egyptians did not just observe this rhythm. They believed it reflected something true about the nature of all things. Everything that was had been before. Everything that ended returned. Death was not an ending. It was part of the cycle, no different from the Nile receding before it flooded once again. This is perhaps the single most important idea to hold when exploring ancient Egyptian belief. The universe, in their understanding, was not moving toward a final destination. It was turning, always returning. A word held in balance. Ancient Egyptian texts describe a concept at the heart of all their religious thought. The ancient Egyptians called it Maat. The word is sometimes translated as truth or justice or order, but none of those translations quite captures what it meant to the people who lived by it. Maat was the right order of things. It was the principle that held the universe together. The sun rising each morning was Maat. The Nile flooding at the proper time was Maat. A ruler governing with fairness, a craftsman doing honest work, a child caring for an elderly parent, all of these were expressions of Maat, and its opposite, chaos, falsehood, imbalance, was a force called Isfet. The gods of ancient Egypt were not distant or indifferent. Believers understood them to be deeply involved in the maintenance of Maat. The gods were not separate from the world, they were woven into it. The sun was not merely illuminated by a god in certain traditions, the sun was itself a form of a god. The Nile was not merely watched over by divine forces, it was, in a sense, an expression of them. This helps explain why the Egyptian pantheon, the family of gods and goddesses, was so vast and so varied. Scholars estimate that hundreds of deities appear across ancient Egyptian texts, temple walls, and burial texts over the course of several thousand years. Some were worshipped across the entire country. Others were associated with particular cities or regions. Some changed in character over time, merging with other deities or taking on new roles as political and religious circumstances shifted. But within this great diversity, certain figures emerged as central. Certain stories were told again and again. And it is through those figures and those stories that we begin to understand what the ancient Egyptians believed about life, death, and what comes after. Ra and the journey of the sun. Perhaps the most fundamental of all Egyptian divine figures was Ra, the sun god, whose daily journey across the sky was understood as a sacred act performed on behalf of all creation. Ra was typically depicted as a man with the head of a falcon, crowned with the disk of the sun, and a coiled serpent. He was among the most ancient of Egyptian deities, and his worship was especially prominent in the city that the ancient Egyptians called Iunu, a place the later Greeks would call Heliopolis, meaning city of the sun. According to ancient Egyptian texts, Ra traveled across the sky in a sacred boat each day, bringing light and warmth to the world. But the journey did not end at sunset. When Ra disappeared below the western horizon, believers understood him to be beginning a second journey, a passage through the underworld, through the darkness beneath the earth, navigating the 12 hours of the night. This nighttime journey was not peaceful. Ancient Egyptian texts describe the underworld as a place of shadows and challenges, where Ra and his accompanying divine beings had to pass through regions of darkness and confront forces that sought to stop the sun from rising again. Chief among these forces was a great serpent called Apep, an embodiment of chaos, who waited each night to devour the solar boat. But Ra and his companions prevailed, and each morning the sun rose again. According to temple inscriptions, this was not simply a natural event. It was a victory renewed every single day, a triumph of order over chaos, of Maat over Isfet. For the ancient Egyptians, watching the sun rise over the desert, this was a profoundly personal assurance. The universe was being held together, the gods were doing their work. And as long as the proper rituals were observed, as long as the temples were maintained and the offerings were made, that order would continue. The story of Osiris and Isis. Of all the myths that ancient Egyptian religion produced, perhaps none traveled as far or endured as long as the story of Osiris. It is a story about a god who died, about the love that brought him back, and about what that transformation meant for every human being who would eventually face their own death. Ancient Egyptian texts tell us that Osiris was a great and benevolent king, a ruler who taught his people the arts of civilization, who brought order and abundance to the land. He was associated with the fertile earth, with grain and growth, with the promise of renewal after the dry season. His sister and wife was the goddess Isis, one of the most widely revered figures in the ancient world. Isis was associated with wisdom, with magic, with protection, and with the fierce devotion of a mother. She was often depicted as a woman wearing a throne upon her head, or with great wings spread wide, a gesture of shelter and care. Osiris had a brother. His name was Set. Set was not entirely a villain in the Egyptian understanding. His character was complex, and in certain traditions, he was honored as a warrior and protector. But within the story of Osiris, Set represents the force of disorder. He represented the threat that chaos poses to established order, the restlessness that turns against what has been built. Ancient Egyptian texts describe how Set came to resent Osiris. The precise motivations differ across different versions of the story, recorded across centuries and inscribed on the walls of many temples. But the essential shape of the myth remains consistent. Set acted against his brother. Osiris was killed and his body was hidden away, scattered across the land so that no proper burial could be performed. It was Isis who searched for him. This part of the myth is told with a quietness that can be easy to overlook. Isis did not rage against Set or call upon armies. She moved through the world with patience and determination, gathering what had been scattered. Ancient texts describe her searching in the form of a bird, sweeping low over the land with wide wings. She recovered what had been lost. And through her knowledge of sacred words and divine power, she was able to restore enough of Osiris to breathe life back into him, enough to conceive their son Horus, who would grow to become the rightful king of the living world. Osiris, however, could not return to the land of the living in the same way. He had passed through death. He had been transformed by it. And so, according to ancient Egyptian belief, Osiris became the king of the realm of the dead, the ruler of the beautiful West, as it was sometimes called. He presided over what the ancient Egyptians called the Duat, the afterlife, the unseen realm that awaited those who had departed the world. The story of Osiris was not understood as a distant myth about gods who lived in another time. Believers understood it as a template, a pattern into which every human death could be placed. Just as Osiris had died and been restored to a different kind of existence, so too could any person who had lived in accordance with Maat pass through death and enter a continued life in the realm of Osiris. Death was a transformation. It was a crossing. And the river, once again, was the model for understanding it. The Nile had retreated before. It always came back. The gods around the story. The myth of Osiris and Isis brought with it a great constellation of other divine figures, each with a particular role in the sacred drama of death and renewal. Among these, one of the most immediately recognizable is Anubis. Anubis is perhaps the most visually striking of all Egyptian deities. He is depicted as a man with the head of a jackal, sleek, dark, alert. His ears are large and upright. His gaze is steady and watchful. He stands or kneels in scenes of burial and judgment with an air of calm precision. Ancient Egyptian texts describe Anubis as the guardian of the process of transformation. He was associated with the preparation of the body after death and with guiding the soul of the deceased through the early stages of its journey. He was not a frightening figure in the Egyptian understanding. He was a protector, a careful and attentive presence at the threshold between one form of existence and another. Thoth was another figure of great importance in the realm of the afterlife. Thoth was the god of writing, of knowledge, of time, and of the careful measurement of things. He is often depicted with the head of an ibis, a long-beaked wading bird common along the Nile, and he carries a reed pen and a writing palette. In scenes of judgment, Thoth plays the role of the recorder, standing ready to note down the outcome of the soul's great reckoning. Hathor was among the most beloved of all Egyptian goddesses, a figure associated with love, music, joy, and the nurturing warmth of the feminine divine. She appears in many forms, as a woman wearing the horns of a cow with the disk of the sun cradled between them, or as a cow herself, gentle and generous. Hathor greeted the deceased in some traditions, welcoming them to the Western realm with offerings of bread and water. She was a figure of welcome as much as worship. And there was Horus, the son of Osiris and Isis, the falcon-headed god of the sky, whose eyes were said to be the sun and the moon. Horus was understood as the divine prototype of the living king. Each pharaoh of Egypt was believed to embody Horus while alive and to become Osiris upon death. The cycle moved continuously through them. The living ruled in the name of Horus. The dead were welcomed into the realm of Osiris. This is one of the most elegant aspects of ancient Egyptian religious thinking, the way in which the divine and the human, the cosmic and the personal, were all woven together into a single continuous fabric. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler. He was a living link in the chain of cosmic order, and when he died, he did not simply disappear. He stepped into a role that the universe had prepared for him since the beginning. The soul in many parts. One of the most fascinating aspects of ancient Egyptian belief is the understanding of what the human self actually is. Unlike many later traditions, which tend to imagine the soul as a single unified thing, ancient Egyptian thought recognized the self as made of several distinct but related elements. Ancient Egyptian texts describe what might be understood as the essential life force of a person, the quality that made them alive and individual. This was sometimes called the Ka'a, a kind of spiritual double that came into existence with a person at birth and remained closely associated with their body after death. The Ka was nourished by offerings of food and drink left at the tomb, and it was for the benefit of the Ka that tomb paintings depicted scenes of abundance, harvest, feasting, music, and daily life. These images were not merely decorative. They were a form of provision, ensuring that the Ka of the deceased would continue to be sustained. A related but distinct element was the Ba, something closer to what we might call personality or individual character. The Ba is often depicted as a bird with a human head, capable of moving between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. After death, the Ba could leave the tomb and travel, returning to the body at night to rest. Tomb architecture and funerary texts were partly designed to facilitate this movement to ensure that the Ba could always find its way home. There was also the Aka concept describing the fully transformed, complete spiritual being of a person who had successfully passed through death and entered the afterlife. The Ah was luminous, effective, and permanent. It was the form the deceased took once the journey had been completed and the soul had been found worthy. The word itself carries a meaning related to light and effectiveness. The Ah was understood as a being of radiance, moving freely through the realms of the divine. Ancient Egyptian funerary practice was, at its heart, about ensuring the correct transformation of the deceased, guiding all these aspects of the self safely through the transition from life to what lay beyond, and ensuring that the Ah could emerge complete on the other side. The Hall of Two Truths. At the center of the ancient Egyptian afterlife journey was a moment of profound moral reckoning. Ancient Egyptian texts, particularly a collection known as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, often called by scholars the Book of the Dead, describe in careful detail what the soul of a deceased person could expect to encounter after death. After passing through the darkness of the underworld, guided by Anubis, the soul arrived in a great hall. Ancient texts describe this as the Hall of Two Truths, a place of judgment presided over by Osiris, surrounded by a council of divine beings. It was here that the fate of the soul was determined. The central ritual of this judgment was the weighing of the heart. The heart, in ancient Egyptian belief, was the seat of the self, the organ that held memory, thought, feeling, and moral character. It was the heart, not the brain, that defined who a person truly was. And so it was the heart that was placed on one side of a great set of scales. On the other side of the scales was a single feather, the feather of Maat, the symbol of truth and right order. If the heart was light, if the person had lived in accordance with Maat, had treated others fairly, had spoken truth, had not caused unnecessary harm, the scales balanced. The heart and the feather rested in equilibrium. And this was the sign that the soul had passed the test. But if the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, if it carried the weight of cruelty or dishonesty, or the violation of the sacred bonds that held human society together, the scales tipped. And waiting beside the scales was a creature ancient Egyptian texts describe as the devourer, a composite being made of the parts of three powerful animals. This creature would consume the heart of the unworthy, and the soul would cease to exist. Not punished in the way that many later traditions imagine punishment, not tormented but simply ended, returned to nothing, the second death. But for the worthy, the scales balanced, and Thoth recorded the outcome. The soul was declared true of voice, a phrase that appears again and again in ancient Egyptian funerary texts, almost like a quiet blessing. True of voice, honest at the core. And from there, the soul could proceed into the field of reeds, the Egyptian understanding of paradise. The field of reeds was described as a place much like Egypt itself, fertile, abundant, threaded with waterways, filled with the things a person had loved in life. Ancient tomb paintings show the deceased plowing fields, gathering grain, fishing in clear water, sitting with family members, listening to music. The afterlife was not an abstract spiritual realm. It was life, continued but freed from suffering and uncertainty, sustained by the same rhythms that had made earthly existence beautiful. Mummification as preparation. When we think of ancient Egyptian burial practices today, the image that most often comes to mind is the mummy, the carefully wrapped body preserved through an elaborate process of preparation. And while this process can seem remote or even unsettling to a modern observer, it is worth understanding what it meant within the Egyptian framework of belief. Mummification was not about fear of death. It was about honoring the transformation that death represented and ensuring that all the conditions were in place for the soul to complete its journey successfully. Ancient Egyptian texts describe how the body was the anchor of the Ka and the home to which the Ba returned. Without the body, or at least a preserved image or representation of it, these aspects of the soul had no fixed point of reference. They could become lost. And so the preservation of the body was understood as an act of care, not an act of dread. It was practical theology. The process of mummification was performed by specialists, and it was conducted with reverence. The body was purified, treated with natron, a naturally occurring salt, and wrapped in fine linen. The organs were preserved separately in containers called canopic jars, each protected by a particular divine being. Spells and prayers from ancient funerary texts were spoken throughout the process, words that addressed the different aspects of the deceased soul and guided them safely toward the afterlife. Burial goods objects placed in the tomb alongside the body served a similar purpose. They were provisions for the journey and for the life that waited on the other side. Furniture, food, clothing, tools, jewelry, and statues all appear in the tombs of ancient Egypt, placed with care and intention. The great tombs of the pharaohs were the most elaborate expressions of this practice. The pyramids themselves were not simply monuments to royal ego. They were extraordinary acts of preparation, vast machines for ensuring the safe passage of the king into eternal life, and through him, the continued stability of the kingdom and the world. Scholars note that Egyptian funerary practice shifted and evolved across the many centuries of the civilization's existence. What was originally available only to royalty gradually became accessible to a broader population. Over time, the spells and guidance of the funerary texts were copied and placed in the tombs of wealthy private individuals. The vision of an afterlife in the field of reeds, once the exclusive privilege of kings, came to be something that any person of sufficient means could aspire to. And the moral framework of the weighing of the heart, the idea that personal conduct in life determined one's fate after death, gave meaning to the choices of ordinary people, not just rulers. Death as transformation. It is worth pausing here in the stillness of all these ancient ideas to consider what is perhaps the most enduring quality of ancient Egyptian belief, the way in which death was understood not as an ending, but as a continuation of something already in motion. The ancient Egyptians watched the sun set every evening and trusted it would rise again. They watched the Nile fall every year and trusted it would flood again. They watched the grain die back in the dry season and trusted it would grow again. This was not wishful thinking. It was a deeply observed pattern, a pattern so reliable that it could only be understood as the expression of something true about the nature of reality. And so, death for the ancient Egyptians was placed within that same pattern. It was not a wall, it was a threshold. The soul did not disappear into darkness. It moved as the sun moved through the night, through an unseen realm, and emerged into a new kind of light. This does not mean that ancient Egyptians did not grieve or that they did not fear the unknown. Their texts are filled with expressions of mourning, of longing, of the very human sorrow of separation. The great love story at the heart of the Osiris myth, Isis, searching the world for her lost husband, is not a story without feeling. It is full of feeling. But even grief, in the Egyptian understanding, was held within a larger story that moved toward reunion. Ancient funerary texts frequently speak to the deceased directly, offering reassurance. They describe the roads of the underworld with quiet confidence, as if laying out a map for a traveler who is simply going somewhere unfamiliar, not somewhere terrible. The gods will be there. The way is known. The scales are waiting, and if the heart is right, the outcome is already written. The long reach of ancient Egyptian belief. The civilization of ancient Egypt endured for approximately 3,000 years, a span of time so long it is genuinely difficult to grasp. The pyramids at Giza had already stood for more than 2,000 years when the Greek philosopher Plato was alive. The ancient Egyptians themselves would have looked back at the builders of the first pyramids the way we might look back at the ancient Romans as distant ancestors from another era. Across that immense span of time, Egyptian religious belief changed and evolved in many ways. New gods gained prominence. Old myths were retold in new forms. The religious center of the country shifted as dynasties rose and fell. Foreign influences entered and were absorbed. And eventually, after centuries of Greek and then Roman rule, the old traditions gave way to new belief systems that would reshape the Mediterranean world. But the ideas did not simply disappear. Scholars observed that Egyptian religious concepts left traces in many directions. The goddess Isis was worshipped far beyond the borders of Egypt. Her temples appeared in Rome, in Greece, in distant provinces of the Roman Empire. The imagery of a loving divine mother, of a child born to restore cosmic order, of a god who died and was renewed. These ideas moved through the ancient world and found echoes in many traditions. The weighing of the heart has been compared by scholars to the moral judgment frameworks of later traditions. The concept of Maat, a universal order that human beings are called to uphold through how they live, resonates with ethical ideas that appeared independently in many cultures. Whether these connections represent direct influence or parallel human reflection is something scholars continue to explore with care. What is clear is that the ancient Egyptians were asking questions that human beings have never stopped asking. What is the self? What happens when we die? How should we live in order to be worthy of what comes after? Is there a pattern to the universe, and are we part of it? They answered these questions in ways that were specific to their time and place, rooted in the rhythm of the Nile, shaped by the landscape of the desert, expressed through the language of their particular divine figures and stories. But the questions themselves are universal. And sitting quietly with their answers, even across the distance of thousands of years, can feel like a kind of conversation. The river continues. The sun is low now over the western bank. The light on the Nile has turned to gold. Somewhere along this river, in a time before writing, the first people who settled its banks looked at the water and saw something more than a river. They saw a promise. They saw proof that what recedes will return, that what dies is not gone, that the darkness between one dawn and the next is not an ending, it is a journey, and the journey has a destination. Over thousands of years, that intuition became a civilization. The quiet observation of farmers became the theology of pharaohs. The flooding of the Nile became the resurrection of Osiris. The rising of the sun became a daily renewal of the sacred order of all things. And the death of every person, from the humblest laborer to the greatest king, became a crossing prepared for with care, guided by knowledge, and held within a story that had no final ending. The ancient Egyptians are gone in the way that all civilizations eventually become part of the past. Their language fell silent. Their temples were buried under sand and built over by later peoples. The long succession of their dynasties came to a close. But the river is still there. The sun still sets over the western desert and rises again over the eastern horizon, just as it always did. The flood still comes in its own diminished and altered way, still following the contours of that ancient valley. And the questions the ancient Egyptians ask, those have not gone anywhere either. What are we truly beneath the surface of our days? What waits in the quiet after the last breath? Is there a weight to how we live, a feather against which our hearts are measured? And if the universe is a cycle, if everything that ends is only resting before it returns, then what is there, really, to fear in the dark? The Nile moves slowly in the evening. The stars come out over the desert, vast and unhurried. The air is cool and still. And somewhere in that stillness, it is easy to imagine the people who first asked these questions sitting right here by this same water, beneath this same sky, and finding in the rhythm of the river an answer they could live by. Thank you for joining us on First Beliefs. If this episode brought you something still and quiet to carry with you, we hope you will return. The river is always moving. The next story is already on its way.